So, since you can't take the square root of a negative number, what we're going to do is break it down into ones that you can, and it's imaginary. So please know, I know that the square root of a negative number doesn't exist, but this is a notation that allows us to work with it. So think about it. I squared is going to be I equals the square root of negative 1. So it's radical negative 1. And when you square that, that's I, I'm plugging it in. When you square that, what do you get? What's the square root of negative 1 squared again?
It's 1.
It's always the number underneath, right? So it's negative 1. The square and the square root cancel out. So you get negative 1. Anytime you have I squared, you're really dealing with a negative 1.
A 1 in the parentheses?
Yeah. The radical negative 1.
So like if it was negative 3,
Yeah.
that's also negative 3.
So
No,
3
I'm
I
gonna show you.
squared would be negative 3.
So that only counts when it's 1.
Did you say 3 times I squared? Yes.
So does that, it only counts when
For right now, we're only looking at the i's. When we're going to look at splitting up into other numbers, I'll show you. So this one, 3i squared. Hold up. No, that's not right. You beat me because of the parentheses. If it was just 3i squared by itself, it would be okay. But the parentheses are there. So it's 9i squared, right?
Alright, yeah.
It's 3 squared and it's I squared. So that makes 9i squared. Write that down. 3 squared and I squared. It's because of the parentheses. That makes a 9 and that makes a negative 1. Anytime you have I squared, it's negative 1. So our final answer would be?
negative
Negative
9. Man, this is too easy.
Yeah, it's pretty simple.
It's easier than yesterday's. I squared and radical 3 squared. I squared is just I squared, but what's radical 3 squared?
It's 3.
3. Good. So we're talking about I squared and radical 3 squared. All right. I squared is
I squared is negative 1.
negative 1. And radical 3 squared is 3. So all you're dealing with now is negative 1 times 3.
That equals negative.
Negative 3.
Is there such thing as a negative 0?
No, 0 is neither positive nor negative.
I remember some girl said that in 8th grade.
Did you argue about it?
Nah.
All right, so let's look at some of these problems. We're not going to go all the way down to the bottom because those will be for the next day. But let's look at how some of these work. Is anyone still writing? Yes. The trick is anytime you see I squared, it's talking about an imaginary number and it represents negative 1. Anytime you see I, you're talking about the square root of negative 1. So whichever direction we're going, you can plug it in that way.
We only have like
For the I, that, or if it's a different number that comes out to 3.
Say it again.
Just like for the I, if you see the I, it's a number that comes out.
It's if you see the I, it only works for that one. It automatically is a negative 1. But with other numbers, we're gonna put the I there in place of it. I'll show you on the examples. There's other times when you're gonna put the I there yourself.
So when the I do come out to negative 1.
I squared will always be replaced with negative 1. I will always be replaced with the radical negative 1, or vice versa. I is the square root. I squared is just the whole number. All right, so let's look at some examples with this. You guys, please don't let that be a distraction. If you're going to eat, just don't let it become an issue. All right, square root of negative 12 does not exist. But if we break it down into a negative 1 and negative 12, I think I already broke that 12 down. What perfect square goes into 12?
it's not up there.
4 does. 4 goes into 12, right?
4 times 3.
3 and 4, good. So watch, I took this and I split it up into negative 1 times negative 12. You've got to look for the I, something that represents the I. You've got to look for a radical negative 1. But then I took the 12 and I broke that down into 4 and 3. Okay, so all the stuff in the past still is a part of it, and you still have to be looking for perfect squares, or if it's a third root, you have to look for perfect cubes. But now all we're going to do is look and see what goes out of the house and what stays in the house. Yeah, I divided by negative 1, I took it out. So that I could have a positive number and then an I. So look, the square root of negative 1 now is represented by the letter I. Okay, that's just a definition. That's just giving us square root of 1 negative 1 is I. What's the square root of 4?
2.
2. What's the square root of 3? It stays as the square root of 3, right? So now to write your final answer, 2 and I are both out of the house, and the radical 3 is stuck in the house.
Wait, why did that?
Because mathematicians had to find a way to deal with that negative under the square root.
Oh, they
Because it
just
shows
put an I.
up, they put an I there.
I.
And so that they can work with it.
I is only negative 1.
Square root of negative 1, yeah?
Square root is negative.
Radical
How
negative
come
1.
the 2 goes in front of the I?
Usually we just put numbers first and letters second. Like it's like a variable, but it's really just the square root of negative 1. Let's try another one. This has to be broken up into several things. First of all, I definitely want to take away the negative 1 so that I'm dealing with positives. Because it's a square root. If I was taking a third root, I wouldn't care. You can have negatives under the third root.
9 and 3.
9 and 3, good, because 9 is a perfect square. We can break that up into 9 and 3. But x to the third, how should I break that one up? Good.
Square.
Because you want one exponent that matches the outside root, and then you write whatever's left over. Questions on that part? Now we see what goes out of the house and what's stuck inside. Square root of negative 1 is I. And when you take the square root of negative 1, it's no longer in the house, it's just I. What's the square root of 9? What's the square root of 3? Stays radical 3. What's the square root of x squared?
X.
What's the square root of x? Radical x. Okay? I won't always do this middle step. I'm just doing that to show you, but usually I just jump from here to the last step, taking what goes outside. So, what goes in front? 3 and
3
I and x. What's stuck inside?
3x.
3x.
Oh, I'm so smart.
This one's easier.
It's not even that
It's a little
anymore.
bit
It's
easier,
like,
yeah.
No, you can't.
Before, what did we do with the negatives?
We said no solution. If it was a square root and there was a negative underneath, it was called no solution. And that's true because there's no real solution. This is an imaginary solution. No, usually people just put it in alphabetical order.
So
I comes before
are we
X.
always going to put on the outside what's on the outside? Like the middle step?
Say it again.
Are we always going to put it on the outside? With the I?
Yeah, anything that came outside will go out, in the outside, in the front. All right, so look at letter C. Square root of negative 81 doesn't exist. We have to go with our imaginary numbers. So it's a square root of negative 1. And what do I do with the square root of 81?
it's 9.
That's 9. Good, I don't have to break it down. So, what is this?
I.
I, does it go in the house or outside the house?
Outside.
Outside, and square root of 81 is
9.
So our answer, we usually write it with the number in front, that's called the coefficient, and the variable last, so it's 9i.
That one was easy.
Letter D. Does anyone have this one memorized, the square root of 121?
11.
Okay, so we have to take out the negative 1 first, and then we're going to take the square root of 121, and then I took the x to the 5th and I split it up into 4 and 1. Because 4 can divide by 2. 5 can't. Any questions on that part of it? That's a review of what we've been doing. Alright, now I'm going to jump to the last step. Instead of writing it all out, I'm going to write down what goes out of the house. I'm going to put that in front and leave space if I need it, and then I'm going to put what's inside the house. So square root of negative 1, tell me. I outside of the house. Square root of 121. 11, and that usually goes in front of the number. When you turn it into 11, it's out of the house. X to the 4th. X squared where?
In the outside.
Outside, because you could divide. Whenever you can divide, you take it outside. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And what happens to this one?
It was inside.
Stuck inside. Let me fix that. I know the pen links. Alright, so that's what our answer would be. 11i x squared radical x. Okay. And then the last one's example 3. No, actually we have 2 more. Good, because I wanted to show you that also. Anyone still ready? I know this is kind of going backwards. It's taking i's and then we're going to simplify it from there. You're not actually taking the square root out. So for this case, you treat it just like it's a variable until the very end. You multiply the coefficients, negative 3 and negative 8 would make,
Negative
Negative
24.
and then what's I times I?
Squared.
I squared. So what we have is negative 24 times I squared. This negative is okay because it's not under a square root. Now all that's left to do is simplify. I squared is negative 1. So that's really negative 24 times negative 1.
So we 24
No, the I actually went away.
Oh, so it's just 24.
Yep, I squared went away and became negative 1.
So it just equals 24.
That's right.
So weird.
That's just how math works.
Getting numbers out of letters.
Exactly.
These niggas are probably studying.
Questions on that? This is just something that you're going to have to start recognizing. Whenever you see I squared or the square root of negative 1, you know that's something you have to deal with. Letter B. You can't turn this into the square root of 60. Normally you can multiply numbers. But since this doesn't exist and this doesn't exist, you can't multiply together two things that don't exist. So we have to simplify them first.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
I broke this down into negative 1 and 6. And I broke this one down into negative 1 and 10. I took the negative 1 out. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 6. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 10. Any questions on that? So now we just keep simplifying. We look for things that we can do. There's no perfect square to break down. There's no perfect square to break down. But what's the negative square root of 1 times a negative square root of 1?
1.
A negative 1. You keep the number that's underneath. Okay? I also just,
60.
yeah, 6 times 10. In this case, I just took your negative 1 and radical negative 1 turned it into I. But you could have skipped a step like I just said earlier. Radical 1 times radical 1 is negative 1.
Squared.
That's right. Which is again negative 1 like we just said.
Right.
But what about the 60? That can break down.
10 and 6.
Yes, neither of those are perfect. So find a perfect square one. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. What goes into 16?
I forgot.
Anyone know?
Wait. Don't tell us yet.
1
8 and
doesn't really
5.
count. Does 4 go into 60? 4 times 15.
I told you.
So I broke it down that way.
15 is not 1.
But the 4 is.
Oh.
The 4 is. So I times I is I squared. Square root of 60 is 4 times 15. So the last thing to do is take this 4 out of the house. When you take the 4 out of the house, you get 2. When you take your I squared, which is already the house, what do you get?
I squared.
Negative 1. That's negative 1. Good. So look, the 4 became a 2. The I squared could become a negative 1. And the square root of 15 stays. So all that's left to do is negative 1 times 2 times the square root of 15, which equals negative 2 radical 15. You normally, if you can simplify the I, you normally do. Only when it's I by itself, you don't take it out. But when it's I squared, you want to simplify it. I know that it's brand new, but is there any questions on the step that I did?
It's brand new.
You could have saved time too by just realizing that negative radical 1 times negative radical 1 would just be negative 1. You can do whatever works for you. All right, the last two. Still writing?